Hello, my name is Caleb Levy. I'm a physics PhD student at Harvard, specifically studying astrophysics. So, first off, I just wanted to thank the organizers for giving me a chance to share my thoughts today. So, my talk is titled Beyond the Buzzword: Responsibility of Platforms in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. So, I want to explore how platforms that build and distribute AI systems, especially large language models, carry not only technical challenges and a drive for innovation, but also social responsibilities. And I'll argue that accountability needs to be built into these systems and not bolted on after the fact. I'll also discuss a bit how machine learning and large language models have impacted some of the research I've done and been doing. And I really want to emphasize there the variety that's included under the umbrella of artificial intelligence. So, on that note, what do we mean by AI? So, when people say AI today, they often mean one narrow branch, and that's the work of the large language models like ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini. The truth is that AI is broader. It includes some classical machine learning algorithms, stuff like reinforcement learning, physics-inspired models, and many other models that are designed for either very specific things or for very general things. So in my own research in undergrad, I've directly worked with and trained models related to object detection in astronomy. And so to be concrete, we use this algorithm up here, which is designed for detecting objects and giving a probability of what they are. And so you have some people and some bottles and a table. Um, but we applied this model to detecting very faint galaxies. So it's just one example of a large language model AI algorithm that was useful in my project. In addition to this, in my current PhD research, I've found the large language models to be invaluable research tools. They're able to look through vast amounts of data, give me good information on them, and point me in directions that I need to research. But I want to point out that there's some danger of LLMs, especially for students not at a PhD level and not doing research. So kids in earlier stages of schooling, high school, or even undergrad. I think it's important that these students learn to think and learn to write in their own way and not just, copy and paste from ChatGPT. So I think there's real danger there, and that's one thing that platforms probably need to be more careful about. The truth is that platforms, whether consciously or unconsciously, sort of shape this perception when they brand everything as AI, and that doesn't actually match the true diversity of, of machine learning algorithms. So, sort of switching gears, I want to talk about this black box type of AI systems. So large language models and other models that have a large amount of parameters are not like classical software. So you can't just trace every single line of code and exactly predict the behavior of the software. They're really huge statistical systems. In the case of LLMs, billions of parameters. And while that makes them very powerful, it also makes them quite hard to predict. We see a lot of emergent behavior, unexpected biases, and the need for a constant fine-tuning in order to address these issues that arise, typically after deployment. So even the platforms themselves don't fully understand why these systems behave the way they do, because this is still a very active area of research. And so this is why I think transparency is key. Users deserve to know that the technology isn't just magic. It is math with limits, and importantly, it's not that well understood. So I think the old machine learning statement that people say still applies here, which is that the model will only be as good as its training data, and it will reflect that training data. And when these models are trained on such massive data sets, it's understandable to see how certain behaviors and biases emerge. So we've seen examples where models confidently produce wrong information, and these are what we call hallucinations. or even worse, when they reinforce harmful stereotypes. Some platforms have addressed this with many methods. So, for example, these things called alignment layers, which allow for human feedback and supervised fine-tuning. And these don't actually rewrite the core model, but they sort of nudge the outputs towards safer and more useful behavior. There's also this notion of red teaming, which tries to provoke the system to produce dangerous or unhelpful results so that they can be adjusted before deployment. One example of this is that it would be quite difficult, as I understand it, to convince ChatGPT at this point that it's sentient, which I'm personally happy about that one. But the lesson here is important, is that accountability many times comes only after deployment and public pressure and after very visible mistakes. And they're not being baked in from the start. And because they're not that predictable, it's difficult to say when you deploy these systems to the world and more users are interacting with it, what kind of behavior is going to emerge. So despite these methods, these AI systems are already being misused frequently. So we've seen deep fakes used to undermine trust in elections, for example, and used as methods for scamming by mimicking voices of loved ones, for example, and asking for ransoms. We've seen disinformation campaigns that have been scaled up with the fact that you can generate text with AI now pretty well. And we've seen automated systems exploit attention for profit in ways that are pretty hard to regulate. I've also seen or also heard about systems being deployed to help job candidates cheat their way through technical interviews, which is another example of a misuse case. And one of the big problems here is relative speed of deployment compared to oversight. And when the platforms are the gatekeepers of these models, it really raises the question of the responsibility they have to prevent the harms, given the fact that they're deploying these systems and the accountability of that. So some platforms are taking more steps, transparency reports about training data and its limitations, clear accountability frameworks, so who is actually responsible when harm occurs, different guardrails like watermarking generated content, restricting risky API access, and integrating fact checking. And perhaps the most important is the partnership with researchers, policymakers, and civil society to monitor risks and prevent harmful actions. So these practices are certainly not perfect, but they're at least showing how platforms can move from being reactive to being more proactive. So where does this leave us? Platforms are not just vendors of tools. They are the gatekeepers of how society interacts with AI. And responsibility means going beyond innovation, which is typically profit-driven, towards stewardship. And accountability means not only preventing harm before deployment, but also having mechanisms to address harm when it does happen, and having a clear structure to do so. The truth is that AI is becoming very quickly embedded into the infrastructure of everyday life, and there definitely needs to be preemptive steps in place to ensure the safety of this infrastructure and to mitigate risks. So I'll just close with this last remark. AI is not just about what these systems can do. And don't get me wrong, they can do some very incredible things, and their behavior, I think, is very fascinating from a research perspective. But it's also about what these platforms allow them to do and how they've set up frameworks to take responsibility for the consequences. So I'll end there. Thank you.